looking at an overhaul of a Leblanc student model wooden clarinet. These instruments have definitely stood the test of time despite their couple of shortcomings, and they tend to clean up really well. So here's the disassembly process and the first cleaning of the rods and pivot screws. Buffing is the next part of the process for me, and it's not my favorite. It's pretty laborious and time-consuming and quite messy, but it is very satisfying to see how well these keys clean up. For this, I'm using the blue Hubble bar, available through Music Medic, I believe. You'll notice that I do not remove the pads before doing the buffing, as this means that I only need to clean out the key cups once. You can see I've put on a new buffing wheel to be able to get in as best as I can to the posts and parts of the body that need to be buffed. Yeah, really critical for the neck as well, and the bell, to have a nice fresh buffing wheel. Here I'm going to do the posts again, and if you want to buff posts, you either have to remove them all or do what I'm doing right here, which is ragging with the same buffing compound every single post. And this is a nice way to check the integrity of the posts to make sure they're nice and tight, and do an initial check to see how well aligned they are. Most clarinets of this age that come in for an overhaul need a lot of cleaning, and you'll see this pile of Q-tips really just continue to grow despite having already used a brush on each one of these tone holes. Now I'm going into the inside of the bore, moving on to the bottom joint. And my water soap solution got pretty dirty, so I needed to change it here to go back and do a nice cleaning of the exterior now, including the faces of each of the tone holes to see if I need to do any repair work, which I'm anticipating for this instrument. And yeah, lo and behold, there are quite a few cracks and chips to be repaired, as well as a really significant crack here on the bottom joint. Now, this technique that I'm using is of my own development, and I can imagine that it looks pretty gruesome even if you're a repair technician, but just briefly to explain what I'm doing here, I'm applying a real little bit of pressure to actually open up the crack and allow the glue to seep all the way down to the bore. So here now I've scored the exterior portion of the crack, which has already been filled with glue and is now completely sealed. And this is for cosmetic effects. Here repairing some damage to a tenon and another little chip that's at the bottom of this top joint. These always clean up really well and look pretty impressive, but this is actually a pretty easy thing to repair once you get the concept. So now I'm having to go through and face any tone holes that need it, and once that's done, I'm applying a nice coat of borer oil to the inside and the outside. Yeah, here you can see some extensive spacing of the tone holes around that crack, which has been repaired. And this is all done by hand, of course. It's just a matter of preference, really, how you want to do it, but for me, Swiss files work pretty well. Placing the tenon corks is pretty standard for everybody. I like to apply a couple of coats of contact cement to both the tenons and the corks, and I'm just waiting for everything to get tacky, nice and dry. In the old days, they used to say that this was a good time to go out and have a cigarette break, but it's not the case for me. And now we're shaping and bringing the tenon corks down to the right diameter to be nice and tight, yet also feeling pretty smooth and easy to disassemble and assemble the horn. I use a lot of different grits of sandpaper for this. I usually go up to about 1,000. And now onto the padding. First having to remove all of the old pads, which are starting to pile up there, and cleaning the key cups as I go. Now scraping off all the old bumpers, which are going to be replaced. And finally cleaning off any leftover residue from the buffing process. These have gone through the ultrasonic machine at this point in time, but I still have to clean everything by hand as well. Now we're installing the pads, and my preference has always been to fill the key cup with glue rather than put glue on the back of the pad. I think both ways can work pretty well, but I feel like I have more control this way. Alright, just putting the post back on that I had to remove earlier, and now we're starting to actually go ahead and do the seating of the pads. I use a couple of different feeler gauges for this, working down to the thinnest possible for the last steps. And I'm clamping the pads after I get contact all the way around the perimeter, just for about a minute or two. Onto the top joint now. I find that my success rate with just feeler gauges is pretty good, and I don't always use a light. Now I'll call this the final process, but really it's a couple of different steps, including regulation and adjustment, which are largely dependent on the kind of materials that you use for bumpers. So starting off here, I'm using various thicknesses of Teflon. I find that super glue is the most reliable thing to use for applying Teflon to keys, but for everything else I'll be using contact cement, and that includes corks, ultra suede, felt, various foams, just depending on what I need. You can see here I'm waiting about 15-20 minutes before actually applying any of these surfaces that are glued with contact cement. And the same procedure again on the top joint. I use a few different kinds of razor blades, but for most of these materials that I'm working with today, the double-edged shaving razor blades work really well. You just have to be very careful with knowing that you always place those in the same location and you don't lose them because they are treacherously sharp. Now that everything has gone through an initial stage of adjustment and regulation, I'll begin the final assembly, checking everything, of course, as I go. So that's the bottom joint, nearly done. And a few more regulation materials need to be placed on the top here, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now we have the final assembly of the top joint. And one of the real shortcomings with this model of instrument is the single register mechanism, which is not really enough for bass clarinet. At least you have a throat beat flat vent, but the intonation on that is usually suspect as well. And the adjustment on this mechanism can be a little tricky too. Now I'm putting back on some of the final pieces of trim. Checking that register mechanism again. Covers, thumb rest, and I like to save this for the end. A little bit of silencing material that I put on the pins of the left hand levers. And restoring this top logo. I'm using the crayon here because it works really well with these Leblancs, but sometimes I prefer other options. And just again checking this register key. And there's our finished product. Came out pretty well and looks even better now that it's in a newer case. I hope you've enjoyed this little overview. I plan to do more in-depth repair videos in the future, so please be sure to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.